Hola y bienvenido to Burr Forman's 2022 Hispanic Heritage Month program. This is Tamika Walters, the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. As a former Spanish teacher and longtime resident of South Florida, I'm quite fond of Hispanic heritage and its many cultural and linguistic nuances. Since 1989, the United States has observed Hispanic Heritage Month annually from September 15th through October 15th. This month-long commemoration helps acknowledge numerous Latin American countries like Costa Rica, Honduras, and Nicaragua that celebrate their independence on September 15th. Today, I am thrilled to be celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with my colleagues as we discuss their culture and the language that continues to build bridges of unity. I'm graciously joined by Gonzalo Gándara, a law clerk from our Orlando office. Gonzalo was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His mother is an English teacher, and Gonzalo went to an English-speaking school. At 21, he visited Orlando for the first time and met with a city official who showed him around City Hall. As a show of thanks, Gonzalo gifted him a chocolate bar and, in a translation gaffe, explained that he bought it from the company that supplied chocolate to the hostages at Disney. You see, the Spanish word for guest, huésped, sounds an awful lot like hostage to someone still learning the English language. To this day, Gonzalo will never forget the look on the city official's face. Even so, he maintains that he is not afraid to make mistakes when speaking in English, as long as he can convey the intended message. Gonzalo has many loves, including asado, which is an Argentinian barbecue, Argentinian folkloric music, reading, and spending time with family and friends. Also joining us is Ereina Guzmán, a billing accountant from our Tampa office. She is the eldest of 5 children and grew up as an Air Force brat, born in California and lived in Shreveport, Louisiana, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Virginia. Ereina's dad moved to the United States during his adolescent years from Havana, Cuba, and her mom is Puerto Rican. Ereina has been in a common law relationship for 13 years, has a 4-legged fur baby, enjoys being creative, and loves the New York Yankees. Sara Solano is an associate born and raised in the Venice of America, also known as Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Her dad migrated to Palisades Park, New Jersey, from Cartagena, Colombia, in early 1960. His family has significant indigenous Colombian ancestry. And before starting school full-time, Sara was moderately conversational in Spanish, as that was a primary language of her paternal grandmother. Sara's mom is of European Jewish descent, born in the Lower East Side of Manhattan with family from Belarus and Austria that immigrated to the United States in the late 1800s. Sara's dad converted to Judaism, so her family practices both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish traditions. One of Sara's strongest, most closely held beliefs is that Colombian empanadas made with yellow cornmeal are better than Cuban white flour dough empanadas. Sara attributes the fact that she was able to graduate from the University of Miami unscathed with such an opinion as a miracle in itself. And I must offer a disclaimer right now that the opinions expressed here today are those of the speakers alone and not those of Burr and Forman, because Sara is trying to start something.
Don't come for me. Don't come for us.
Welcome to all of our speakers. We're going to start the program today with a discussion of your individual backgrounds and your lived experience as Hispanics in the United States. After that, we're going to discuss Spanish pronunciation for English speakers, which will be a lot of fun. So let's jump right into it. We provided some clues about each of your identities in the introductions, but I want to hear it straight from you. So how would you describe your cultural identity? Let's start with Gonzalo.
Okay, thank you, Tamika. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. This is a very interesting question. When you sent me the questions, every time I read it, I had a different answer. I'm not sure exactly what to say. I would say I'm Argentinian, with all that means. We are basically a country that was made out of people coming from different countries. We have a lot of descendants from Spanish people, from Italian, from French. We have native people, of course, and that mixture is what created our identity. I consider myself Hispanic, Latino. Of course, I'm Argentinian, but I have a very strong identification with what being Argentinian means. And then the question, my question is, what does that mean? Many people criticize us in Latin America. I have friends in Colombia that criticize us because they say we think we are more European than the rest of Latin America, but that's not true. Even though we have a great, I'm not sure the word is footprint, but we have a great ascendancy from all these people that came from Europe. So as I said, it's a mixture of things. In many things, like for example, the way my grandmother decorated her living room looked European, but then we listened to Argentinian folkloric music from the north of the country that has its origins with the Native Americans. So it's a very complex question, and I'm sorry, I'm not very precise with the type of answer, but definitely the first thing that comes into my mind is I'm Argentinian.
Well, what you're bringing out, Gonzalo, is that identity is complicated. It's layered. There's texture from all these different influences, and so it's not necessarily meant to be precise. So thank you very much for sharing that. Sara, what about you? How would you describe your cultural identity?
So mine is interesting because I do sort of exist at like an intersection of two different identities. And so I've always kind of joked that I'm like a kosher arepa. I have a strong identification with both my Colombian heritage and my, European Jewish heritage. And I think kind of where they intersect has led at least me and my dad, who have kind of undertaken this, I guess, research together, but we've always been kind of fascinated with the history of Judaism in Colombia. And it's an interesting history because, predominantly Latin American and Central American countries are predominantly Catholic historically, notwithstanding like indigenous representation, but there is an interesting history of like post-Spanish Inquisition migration of Jews who have come to various countries. And, where my family's from in Cartagena, it's specifically very coastal and it has a different vibe, I guess you could say, than like the rest of Colombia. So like if you think of Colombia, you think of like Bogota, and it's very mountainous and the cuisine is very like of the land. Whereas where my family's from, everything's of the sea. And so it's really seafood oriented and it's a port city. So there was all this migration. And so, my dad and I have kind of looked into that, and there's synagogues that have been in Colombia for really long time. And so it's been a really interesting way to kind of embrace both sides of my cultural identity, to go on that exploration with him, when he did his conversion to Judaism. And so I think that's probably the best way to kind of summarize it. But yeah, like Gonzalo was saying, a lot of it kind of relates back to like how my grandmother decorated her house and like all the tchotchkes, like anywhere you turn, there's just like some of this or some of this, like it's everywhere. And it's just kind of always at the forefront of your mind. So I've never been, wanting for a reminder of who I am and where we came from.
That's beautiful. It does seem to me as an outsider, like Colombians are very proud and, the colors are everywhere. They're going to have some clothes in those colors, some flags, it's a proud culture, which is lovely. Ereina, what about you? How would you describe your cultural identity?
Mine is not as descriptive of it as everybody else because I am a mixture of both my parents, my father coming from Cuba, my mom being her parents from Puerto Rico. But I have always been proud to say that I'm Cuban Puerto Rican, and a lot of people are like, wow, that is a mixture. But I would say that Latin American, Cuban, Puerto Rican is how I would identify myself and our family.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So much of our cultural identity comes from what we experience with our families as children, the tastes, the smells, the sounds, the colors, the people, and the languages that surround us. And you've already started touching on this, mentioning your grandmother's things around the house or what you listen to with your family. But Ereina, I want to hear from you specifically. What are some of your fondest cultural memories from your childhood?
Well, one of my fondest is the family time we would spend in the kitchen, watching my dad and my mom prepare either a Cuban or Puerto Rican meal or a combination of both, and then teaching us how to make those meals is something I will never forget. And to this day, that's where we all meet, is in the kitchen, and tell our stories, how our day was. And that's something that I will never forget. And another would be we celebrate the Three Kings on January 6th. That's something we've always done, and getting an extra gift after Christmas is something a kid will never forget. But that's just another tradition that we have always had, and we've passed down to our family as well.
That's great. Yes, extra Christmas gifts, always a bonus. Sarah, what are some traditions or celebrations in which your family participated as you were growing up?
So I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to sort of double dip on my holidays, because we would celebrate, for example, Hanukkah, and then we'd go celebrate Christmas with my dad's family. And so that was always a big plus for a kid, to kind of get double the holidays. But we would always just try to integrate things into, like, for example, for Passover, my grandma would always cook arroz con coco, and we would have that as part of our Seder, even though it's obviously not a traditional Seder food. It was just something we had always done, and it was always like a fun way to kind of bridge the gap between cultures. And then for Hanukkah, we'd always have people over. And traditionally for Hanukkah, one of the things that you do to celebrate is you cook deep fried foods, because it relates to the miracle of Hanukkah with the oil and the menorah. And so, traditionally you cook potato latkes or jelly donuts, but we would also be like frying plátanos and listening to Carlos Vivas. And so it was just a fun way to kind of do everything all at once, and it kind of kept everyone engaged. And I feel like I had a very unique, Passover and Hanukkah and all the Jewish holidays. They were very signature Solano events.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And extra gifts too, it sounds like.
Huge plus.
Now, Ereina, I'm going to come back to you. You were born in the continental U.S., but one of your parents is from Puerto Rico, the other's from Cuba, both islands which have fairly unique status and relationships with the United States, and both which have heavily influenced the broader American culture and political landscape. As an American from a military family with your particular cultural background, why is Hispanic Heritage Month important to you?
I think it gives us an opportunity to share and explain our differences, our beliefs, and our traditions. Just because we're Spanish doesn't mean that everything's the same. My grandmother is obviously Cuban, and certain words she would say would be pronounced differently for a Puerto Rican. So it just gives us an opportunity to explain those issues.
Yeah, so sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'm done.
So we can get into the nuances instead of just having everyone under this large umbrella and thinking of everyone as a monolith. There are differences, as you pointed out.
Exactly.
Great. Gonzalo, in some ways, you have the freshest perspective on the Hispanic identity because you are a recent transplant to the United States. And I'm curious about how you relate to your identity here versus how you may have thought about it when you were back home in Argentina. So I'm going to pose this question to you. What does it mean to be Hispanic?
Very interesting question. Before coming to the States, what I had in mind was, I'm Argentinian. As I said before, Argentina is in Latin America, therefore I'm Latin American. But whenever I had to refer to my origins, is what I always thought, the first thing that came into my mind is I'm Argentinian, period, right? Then once I came here and I needed to complete all these forms for whatever I wanted to do, where they asked me my ethnicity, my origin, and I started to think more about it. But I think that, to be Hispanic or Latino, Latin American, and this is something probably we'll talk about it later, but even though between the Latin American countries, we have some differences in the way we talk or in the cultures, we have very common grounds that I think that are very solid, in the sense that and this is what I believe identifies us most, is we're very warm, friendly. We love being with friends. We don't have like a big structure in the sense that, okay, if I want to meet a friend, I just pick up the phone, call him and tell them like, hey, come home tonight at 8. Does that work for you? Yes, please. That's perfect. I'll go. I'll be there at 8, and maybe it's 7:40. And you just get dressed and go. We don't need like such a big thing to prepare to meet with friends. So that lack of structure is something that's a characteristic of us. In fact, that happens to me with some of my American friends. When on a Saturday night we went to meet for dinner, and they asked me if we are meeting at American time or Argentinian time, because we usually have dinner around 9:30, 10 p.m. In fact, in Buenos Aires, if you go to a restaurant on a Saturday night at 7, it's probably empty, 7 p.m. And if you go at 10:30, it's at its best moment, it's full. So I think those two are part of the main characteristics, being friendly and very warm. And we tend to kiss all the time when we say hi to people, to our friends, we hug. We're not what we consider, we're not cold. For some people, that could be like not respectful, to be hugging and so much touching, but that's how we were born, and it's part of our culture. It's in our veins. And this lack of, as I said, this lack of structure. If I want to meet a friend, I just call them 10 minutes before the time, and if they are available and they want to meet or join, they'll go. So yeah, I think those are the main characteristics.
That's so interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that. But you're right. Like here, especially, working in the legal industry, it's like, I need something on my calendar. I need to know when and where, and, all the details in order to plan it. So that's fascinating, the idea that you're more fluid, and it's just, hey, we're going to go over here.
Yeah, I love that. I love that word. I'm as a native Spanish speaker, my brain talks to me in Spanish, so I'm looking for the words in English as I move forward. Sometimes I'm not able to express the way I would like to in English, but exactly, that's what I meant. More fluent, more, we improvise a lot, let's say, if that could be a way of saying it. And as you said, I have many American friends that tell me, hey, let's schedule in our agendas to meet for lunch next week. And today an hour ago, I was buying my lunch in a restaurant across the street, and I have a Colombian friend that works in a firm across the street, and he called me at 12 sharp. Do you want to go out for lunch now? What are you doing? I'm buying food. Oh, I'll join you, and it's just, we just go with the flow.
And lastly, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but there is that difference in timing with a lot of cultures. I'm of Jamaican descent. I was born in Jamaica, and so that's very much my culture. And all over the Caribbean, it's the same thing. If you're going to have a party, even if you say it starts at 8 or 9, nobody takes that seriously. We all know that you're going to show up later than that. And I understand that in some African countries it's the same as well. It's just, it's interesting, in America, this emphasis on punctuality is so important, and it makes a lot of sense. It's efficient, it's organized, but it's not necessarily the way that everyone operates. So thank you for pointing that out. Sara, let's go back to you. What would you say are some misconceptions about Hispanic culture?
I think probably the biggest one, and I think it's something that Ereina had pointed out earlier, is that, Hispanic culture isn't a monolith, and like everyone doesn't necessarily come from the same cultural background or traditions or experiences and ethnicity. I think there's a lot of kind of making the assumption that, all Hispanic people kind of have the same look, but there's a lot of overlook of like the Afro-Latina experience and Afro-Latino experience, and where they come from, and their experiences are completely different than someone's experience like me or Gonzalo or Ereina. So I think just kind of making the assumption that we all kind of come from this like Sofia Vergara like umbrella, and that's kind of it. That's kind of all we are, and that's what you can expect. And yeah, I think that's probably the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. Ereina, I want to ask you a similar question. What do you wish others knew about your culture?
It's the same thing that Sara just mentioned. I mean, that's just because we speak Spanish doesn't mean that we're all part of the same group. I mean, every culture, every different type has their own unique thing. Granted, like Gonzalo said, we're all pretty much warm, very family oriented. There are a lot of things that are the same, but there are a lot of things that are so different, and to be lumped into one group is just disheartening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to switch gears a little because so far you've all been sharing your personal perspectives on your culture sort of in general, but let's take it into the realm of careers. Sara, how has your cultural heritage played a role in your legal career?
So probably the biggest one has been just the opportunity to network using my contacts from my cultural background. I mean, I had for someone of Hispanic background, being able to go to the University of Miami has been a huge asset. I mean, I realize that not everyone has the ability to take advantage of, what was offered to me in terms of networking opportunities that come with being in Miami. Obviously, there's a huge Hispanic, primarily Cuban, but generally Hispanic population, and that translates to the legal profession down there as well. A lot of the alumni from the University of Miami are of Latin background, and so being able to meet and network with people who come from a similar background has been really enriching and really beneficial. And I think that's probably been one of the most rewarding things in terms of my legal career. But also just, I mean, I've had opportunities at Burr because of my background to meet with clients who were interested and who value diversity, and just being able to get FaceTime with clients possibly earlier than other associates similarly positioned has been a wonderful opportunity, and something that I've really enjoyed, and I've really, not taken for granted. So all of those opportunities that have been presented to me so far have been wonderful.
That's wonderful. And I do want to take a moment to celebrate the fact that the legal industry has evolved, because there was a time when people of your background really were excluded. And now we are focusing on inclusion and creating those opportunities, encouraging those opportunities for networking and professional development. And so we still have a ways to go, but we have come far from where we used to be. So that's something to celebrate. Gonzalo, how, in your opinion, how vital is the representation of Hispanics in the legal field?
Good question. I think, from the perspective of the United States, right, being here, I think considering that the Latin American population is growing and it's so big right now, and also considering that so many Latin American people / Hispanic people are doing business in the States, especially in the Southeast, I think it's very important, not only because it's necessary to have people that actually speak the language, speaking Spanish, and I was surprised in my experience here in the United States about how many Latin American people living here for several years don't know how to speak in English. So they need to have people that translate or are able to understand them. I mean, it's not only because of a language barrier, but also because of the culture / idiosyncrasy, if that is the word, or if that's the way I should pronounce it. I'm not sure if it's idiosyncrasy or idiosyncrasy. I'm sorry for that. Idiosyncrasy. I definitely think that there should be certain representation, at least in a minimum way that will allow them to, to join the community and feel represented and feel that they can continue with their lives in all the different aspects in a normal way, without having these barriers of, not only, as I said, the language, but also not being understood. I think something, and this is answering the previous question you made to me, is most of the countries have the same idiosyncrasy in the way our systems work, in the way, our governments work. We have the similar issues, the similar struggles. And that's completely different to the reality of someone that was born and raised in the United States, probably. So that bridge is very important, to have someone serving as a liaison to bring the cultures together is very, very important.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a core of client service, is understanding the client's business and their issues. And so culture applies to that as well. Language applies to that as well. So you're making an excellent point. And I'm going to just pose this last question to any and all of our panelists. So, you guys jump in. whoever feels moved, what advice would you give to a young Hispanic or Latinx student interested in pursuing a legal career?
I was on mute. I'm probably the closest, to that experience. I was in law school fairly recently, and I would say probably just seek out a mentor-mentee relationship with someone of a similar background as you, just to have somebody who understands where you're coming from, your priorities, your values, and your ethics system. And that could either be through your law school, a professor, or a local bar association. There are a lot of local Hispanic bar associations in big cities and probably small cities as well. And I think just kind of seeking out those contacts and those networking opportunities, like I had mentioned before, that I had the opportunity to take advantage of. And if it's not something readily available, just doing your best to kind of make that path for yourself, just to have somebody that you can confide in and bounce ideas off of from a non-judgmental place, who kind of understands where you're coming from.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Gonzalo.
My advice, for example, for someone like me that was born and raised in Latin America and coming to the States to pursue a legal career, my first advice would be to think ahead of time what the visa process requires, because it's not easy. It takes long, it takes time, and it's not something that could be fixed from one day to the other. You apply for the visa, it takes time before you actually get the permit and everything. So that would be one of the first things I would tell them, because it was one of my mistakes. I was just going with the flow, not thinking ahead of time, and then I realized that that the process took longer than what I expected. And my second advice would be, most of the Latin American countries are civil law systems. So we have a different systems in many aspects. So a great advice to someone that would, if it's a person that's going to do an LLM, because, well, if you're going to do a JD, you're going to sit for those courses anyway. But for those that come to sit for the LLM, is to take real property and evidence at law school, because then if not, you're going to struggle when sitting for the bar. Those were the two more complex courses that I found, because it's completely different to the type of evidence system that we have and the real property system that we have from the Code of Napoleon, in these 17 or 1800s. That would be a big advice if you don't want to struggle while studying for the bar.
For being so open about your cultural experiences. I know all of our listeners will learn a lot from the discussion, but I feel we would be remiss if we did not at least touch on the main cultural aspect that to some extent unites all Hispanics and Latinos. Even if one of Hispanic descent does not speak a word of Spanish, the language may be present in their surname, or in family recipes, or in the conversations of their abuelos. Given this unifying aspect of language, we want to take a few moments to provide an English speaker's guide to proper Spanish pronunciation. Proper pronunciation is critical to being understood. Without proper pronunciation, you can know all the words and all the conjugations and yet be incomprehensible to native Spanish speakers. Improper pronunciation also robs a language of its lyrical beauty, in my opinion. So we will share tips on how to avoid 3 common pitfalls facing native English speakers when they are speaking Spanish. So one of the things I truly love most about Spanish is that, unlike English, it looks like it sounds. Once you know how to pronounce each of the letters, you can pretty much read any Spanish word. Whereas in English, there are multiple ways to pronounce the same letters, like the CH in chartreuse, church, and archetype are all completely different. We also have tons of homonyms in English that look completely different, but sound the same, like their car over there, or they're great. Same sound, completely different words. The beauty of Spanish is pretty much that every word sounds like it looks. And for this reason alone, it's worth learning the proper pronunciation of each Spanish letter. So we will go over the pronunciation of a few letters. We will discuss false cognates, which are words that, Spanish words that may look like an English word, but don't have the meaning that you would think. And we will end with a humorous but true story about mistranslations. But before we jump into the lesson, I want to point out that there are differences between the Spanish spoken in different countries. And we did touch on that in the first segment. Just as English sounds different in Australia versus the United States versus Canada or England, Spanish sounds different depending on the speaker's country of origin. In addition, different Spanish countries may use different words for the same object. So this next slide gives an example. In Spain, coche means car, but in Mexico and Chile, coche refers to a horse-drawn buggy. In Spain, carro refers to the horse-drawn buggy, but in Mexico, carro means car. And in, I think it's Argentina, right? Gonzalo,
Yes.
you would say auto, right?
Oh, yeah. You can call it coche too, but the most common term would be auto.
There we go. And similarly, in a stroller in Mexico is carriola, but in Argentina, the word for stroller is cochecito. It's all Spanish, but it's different types of Spanish. That being said, there are some general rules about pronunciation that will help English speakers to communicate, no matter what Spanish-speaking country they may be in. So let's dive into that. Issue number 1 is proper pronunciation of Spanish vowels. Ereina, could you please pronounce these Spanish vowels?
Wasn't ready. I'm sorry. You want me to pronounce them?
Yeah, just pronounce them in Spanish.
I'm going to be guessing here because I don't really speak fluent Spanish. I don't know what I would be. O and u.
Very good. Excellent. Excelente. I feel like I'm back in my Spanish teaching days. Excelente, Ereina. A, E, I, O, U. The sounds are generally sharp. Like if you have a music background, think staccato rather than legato. In English, we draw it out a little bit more. So we say A, E, I, O, U. It's kind of a smooth and elongated sound. Versus in Spanish, it's a bit of a sharper sound. And the reason this matters is because here's the difference. If I were to say, I'm going to say a sentence with kind of an American English accent. Me llamo Ereina. Me llamo. Okay, so she's laughing because it just kind of, it doesn't sound good, right? Whereas, and the reason it doesn't is because the vowels are elongated. Me llamo. Doesn't sound good. At least to a native speaker. So what you want to do is keep it sharp. Me llamo Ereina, right? And that sounds a little more natural. Guys, if at any point I'm wrong, please do correct me. But that's my understanding as a native English speaker who has learned some Spanish. All right. Issue number 2. Spanish and English have almost identical alphabets and many similar sounds. This tricks people into thinking that if the letters look identical in English and Spanish, that their pronunciation is identical in both languages. To avoid saying Spanish letters with an American English accent, I want to discuss pronunciation tips on just 4 Spanish letter sounds. Just 4. We can't do the whole alphabet, right? La letra D. All right. In English, D is pronounced by placing the tongue on the roof of the mouth. D. Think about your tongue placement as you say the word doctor, doormat, delivery. If you notice where your tongue is, it's hitting the roof of your mouth. But in Spanish, the D is pronounced more like a hard TH, if you want to think of it that way, like father, where your tongue is actually coming behind your teeth, both your upper and your lower teeth, rather than hitting the roof of your mouth. So Sarah, let me know if you're comfortable, but could you pronounce these words with the letra D?
Sure. Día, diciembre, domingo.
Ah, beautiful. Did you, I hope
Shift it
people
a
are
little.
hearing. Yeah, I hope you're hearing that. It's more of a TH than a D sound. It's kind of like in between, but that is also one of those telltale signs that someone's not a native Spanish speaker, is how they're hitting that D sound or the
It
D.
would sound like día, diciembre, domingo.
Exactly. It's not like, I mean, people will understand you, but it's just, it's not quite right. So beautifully demonstrated. Thank you, Sarah. La letra E. Okay, this is pronounced most often like an English Y, not like an English L. So you make a huge mistake if you were to look at these words and say lamada, ela, luvia, or lave. It's hard for me to even say because it's so wrong, right? But people do sometimes, they'll say llama and say, well, actually that is correct. Never mind. Just know that this is pronounced more like a Y sound, except for in some countries where it's pronounced more like a j sound, and others where it's pronounced like a j or a j sound. So Gonzalo, could you please pronounce these words as you would say them in Argentina?
Yes, of course. I would say llamada, ella, lluvia, llave. But
I love it. I love it. I'm a big fan of how Argentinians say ella. I love it.
But some people say llamada, ella, lluvia, llave, more like an SH. So you could hear both. But my friends in Latin America make fun of us because they say, first of all, the Colombian friends say that we don't speak the appropriate Spanish, and I probably agree with them. We kind of change the way we should pronounce or the type of words we use, but many of them in Latin America would say llamada, ella, lluvia, llave, more like, I don't know what would be the English equivalent for that, but it's more like, it sounds, I think it's more beautiful. It sounds like a song, you know, like softer, like llamada, ella, lluvia. I don't know. It's just a perception of how it sounds.
I mean, I think they're both beautiful, but it's very noticeable, that difference. I will say, as a non-native Spanish speaker, Colombian Spanish is the easiest to understand. It seems so pure. It's like the Spanish that you learn in school. So that may be why they're trying to correct the Argentinians.
I've always heard that Colombians speak Spanish kind of like we're crying. Like it kind of comes from like guttural. It's just like, hey, yeah. Like it's the like telenovela Spanish. So I think that's like become the gold standard.
Telenovela, oh gosh, I've never heard that. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I've been told that some Spanish speakers will say it more like a J, like llamada. Is that correct? Ella, lluvia, llave.
Yeah,
I haven't heard that as much, but
I think that's probably very like a Miami Cuban accent.
Yeah, I would agree.
Very interesting. So as we're demonstrating, different countries are going to have slightly different pronunciations, but your safest bet is to pronounce it like a Y, because that, everyone is going to get, everyone's going to understand and relate to. All right, las letras B. And I'm saying the one sound for both letters. Of course, in English, this is B and V, but in Spanish, no matter which one, it's going to be a softer sound. In English, you pronounce the B by putting the lips together. And if you were to put your hand in front of your mouth, there's like a little puff of air that comes out. So think of the word bus. Notice how my lips are coming together. Brilliant or bend. My lips are coming together to say that B. It's a hard sound, but in Spanish, the lips sometimes barely touch when making the sound. It's a softer B sound, more like a, well, I can't even demonstrate it without saying an actual word. Also, depending on where these letters may appear in a word, they may be even softer. So we're going to go over some examples of how to pronounce these letters in Spanish. So the B sounds hard at the beginning of a word or next to another consonant. So, and Ereina, I am very interested in how you pronounce it, because I could be wrong, but it's my impression that the Puerto Rican B is actually a little harder than maybe some others. So could you please pronounce these words for us?
I would pronounce it vaso, voz, voelo, boricua, bueno, bella.
Beautiful. And hopefully people are noticing how soft her B was. Like, it wasn't an English B sound. There was a softness to it as she was pronouncing it. Even though it's like the harder of the two ways to pronounce it in Spanish. So on the next slide, we're going to practice the sound of the V next to other consonants. Ereina, could you please pronounce these words?
Me again? Blusa, cambia, samba.
Excellent. Blusa, cambiar, samba. Again, it's a softer sound than you would say it in English. And guys, if you know, Sara, Gonzalo, if you want to jump in or add anything, feel free to do so. Now, the B sound the B sound is softer when it appears in the middle of two vowels or in the middle of a word. So, for example, this would be centavos, trabajar, avenida, abogado. Again, it's even softer than you might hear it at the beginning of the word, like Ereina was doing. Okay, and then you have some words where you have the sound both at the beginning of the word and in the middle of the word. So it's actually kind of harder at the beginning and softer in the middle. I'm actually going to ask Gonzalo to pronounce these for us.
Okay, so vivir, bebé, buscaba.
So soft, right? I mean, at least to an English ear, it's a very soft sound, like a smooth sound. And I'm sure if you were to watch as he was pronouncing that, you would see his lips are not really pursed quite as much as they would be if he was pronouncing the English B. Thank you very much. You both did a great job of demonstrating that. All right, la letra R. So, you know, in English, we look at this and this is an R, and our mouth kind of purses up like this, like road, rough, roof. You know, it's coming together and you're going to see our teeth. Completely different sound in the Spanish language. What you're actually doing to pronounce this is you are flicking the tip of your tongue on the roof of your mouth, just the very tip of it. So these words would sound like razón, río, rápido, rayo. Again, it's just hitting the roof of your mouth with just the very tip of your tongue to get that right. And then perhaps the toughest Spanish letter for English speakers is the R. And I can't even say it completely right even now. I do the best that I can, but we're going to practice together. I've been told that young children in Spanish-speaking countries use a sentence to practice not only the R, but the 5 Spanish vowels that we went over earlier. So we're going to show it on the screen right now. And I'm going to say it in an American English accent. El burro sabe más que tú. Yuck, right? El burro sabe más que tú. I'm drawing out the vowels and I'm mispronouncing the R. So, Gonzalo, could you please demonstrate the proper pronunciation?
Yes, sure. I would say, el burro sabe más que tú. Although I have to say, in Argentina, instead of tú, we use vos in general. And of course, this is depending on the region of the country. There might be some provinces that use tú, but in general, we use vos. So I would have said instead, el burro sabe más que vos.
Okay, so much to point out. Hopefully people are hearing that rolling of the R's. Can you say burro one more time?
You know, I always ask my American friends when they try to speak Spanish to say the rrr, and they can't. That's the toughest thing. The rrr. There's a tongue twister that we were told when we were kids. I don't remember it, but it was sort of R con R cigarro. It's all the time like rrr. El burro sabe más que tú.
Well, I do feel better knowing that like you had to practice it a lot, you know, as kids, and that's why it's easier, because I just feel kind of incompetent. Like, why can't I do it quite as well?
No, it's tough. It is.
I just need more practice, apparently. Okay, Gonzalo, what does this sentence actually mean?
I think the translation would be that the donkey knows more than you.
And in my case, that's probably true when it comes to pronouncing the R. Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to issue number 3. False cognates are words that look and sound very similar, but don't have the same meaning across languages. And here are a few Spanish words that look like English words, but definitely do not have the same meaning. Embarazada, bizarro, real, and emocionada or emocionante. We're going to go through these one by one. So, Sarah,
Yes.
we have embarazada. If you didn't know, what might you think this word means in English?
It looks an awful lot like embarrassed.
Right, that's what one would logically think. It would be, you know, reasonable to think that. But Gonzalo, what does it actually mean?
Pregnant.
Exactly. Ereina, if I wanted to say embarrassed in Spanish, do you know what would I use?
No.
Gonzalo, what would I use?
Avergonzado.
Yeah, avergonzado. So completely different, right? And this can trip people up. And certainly if you're, you know, unless you're like a transgender, if you're a man, you don't want to go around saying that you're embarazada, right? That would be a little confusing to people. Okay, so let's go over bizarro. Sarah, what's your best guess of what this word means?
Bizarre.
Yeah, I would think so, right? Anyone want to tell us what it actually means? Gonzalo, do you know?
Well, I have a caveat about this one because I didn't know the word in English, but I think in Spanish I would use the term, bizarro, as something strange or extraño, right?
Mm-hmm.
I believe it's not the most common word in Latin America to use bizarro. We use it, I use it a lot in Argentina. Most people maybe would use extraño instead.
Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, I was told that bizarro would mean valiant, like think of like courageous or gallant. But this is again showing that it just depends on what country you're in terms of what the word means. But you did point out that is it extraño or extraño?
Extraño.
Extraño would be the word that you'd want to use if you wanted to say bizarre in Spanish.
Yes, not sure what the Spanish Royal Academy would say about the term. At least the Spanish we speak in the street with my family and friends. And it's more a term that maybe younger generations would use, but this is clearly a word that my wife and I would refer to. Esto es muy bizarro, like saying, you know, this is very weird, strange.
Do you guys say raro too?
Raro, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, that's what I learned a long time ago. All right, real. Sarah, what do you think it means?
That is an English word, real.
Yeah, right. And this one we're going to find out is heavily nuanced as well. It turns out that real means royal. At least that is one of the meanings. But Gonzalo, you actually use this word real to mean real, right?
Yes, I mean it's a synonym. It's the same word meaning two things. Real is the royal family. I would say La Familia Real. But real is also something that's I'm trying to think for the word true. What I'm trying to look for the exact translation, because true would be verdadero. Real, yeah, real. It's exactly the same. I mean, if you say real in the real life, in la vida real, it's the same. It's literally, and you write it the same way. So again, real could be the royal family, royal, or could be real.
Right.
And it's the same pronunciation in Spanish for both.
So the takeaway here is if you say real, make sure you're using it in the appropriate context. So that makes sense. Okay. And then last one is emocionada or emocionante, right? Ereina, what would you think this means?
Emotions.
Yeah, emotional, right? That's what it looks like. But it turns out it actually means excited. But what is the Spanish word for emotional, Gonzalo?
Sensible, probably. Yes, that would be the way I would translate it.
Okay. And just so you know, ladies, do not go around saying that you're excitada. I will not go into what that means, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. So you definitely want to stick to emocionada. Just take my word for it. I did that once and I learned my lesson. So that kind of is a segue to our very last segment, which is talking about mistranslations. And Gonzalo, you have a story where something about a chariot that turned into a trip to the farm.
Yes, I have lots of anecdotes of myself trying to speak in English, especially when I have people visiting from the States and they came home for the whole day. While living in Argentina, I used language in English. I spoke in English, I read in English, but not all day long. So after spending the whole day with a friend of mine, doing this exercise of thinking in Spanish and translating into English, at some point my brain got too exhausted and I started throwing in words that made no sense at all. And this happened in my family's farm. I had a friend visiting from Orlando, and I wanted to tell him an anecdote from my grandmother from the 60s or the 70s when my father was a kid. And it was very common that at that time they rode chariots, or in Spanish we will call it wagon. I'm not sure if the translation would be wagon. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But that big thing with the smaller wheels at the front and the bigger ones at the back with two big horses, And she went to town to buy some to the grocery from the farm. It was around, let's say, 8 miles away. And when she was going to come back, they were told that the guerrilla, which we had at that time, 2 guerrilla men were in the area, so she had to be careful. So she was alone with her 2 kids going back. And I was trying to tell this whole story to my friend, but instead of saying chariot, that was what came into my mind. I don't know why I said carrot. So I kept on telling him, like, my grandmother rode a carrot. So, now I think maybe he was in his mind, he had like a witch that instead of riding a broom, she was riding a carrot. I don't know what image came into his mind, but I have many of these anecdotes.
Yeah. It's just hard when you're, like you say, you think in one language, but then you're speaking in another. It can be truly exhausting. So kudos to you, because you're doing that pretty much every day these days. So I really admire that, and you shouldn't feel in any way bad when you miss a word at all. Well, that concludes our 2022 Hispanic Heritage Month program. Thank you to all of our speakers. You guys were awesome. And again, I learned so much during this program, and it's just always enriching to hear people's culture and their family practices. And it's just one of the ways that we try to create an inclusive environment here at Burr Forman. To anyone listening to this program, buena suerte, or good luck with your Spanish pronunciations, and que tengan un buen día. Have a great day. Thank you.